what's happening today? Today, we see that cities are growing more than ever. By 2050, about 70% of the world's population will live in cities. I assume that many of the people listening already live in cities, but think about all the people who don't, and think about the different countries in the world where gradually urbanization is happening and people are moving out of these rural areas and concentrating into cities. This is a huge trend, and we see it's also been exacerbated by the pandemic. And so as cities grow, obviously there are challenges that we sometimes expect and sometimes don't, but there's a lot of interesting data that can demonstrate what are these challenges and can help us prepare for the future years of smart cities and of cities that are more populated and dense. So one of the first problems that we see in cities is the lack of civic engagement. Think about your city, or think about where you live, or think about where you visit. How often are you really connected to your neighborhood or to your community or to the place that you're visiting and to the local government? People today, less than ever, are engaged with their community. And social media, the Amazons, the big box retailers, they're national in the US and global companies also. And so at the end of the day, we find ourselves online navigating between different communities in different locations, and often neglect that little park that's right across from our street. We often neglect speaking to the neighbors. We may speak to a bunch of communities online on different forums, but we don't know who our neighbors are. That kind of sucks, frankly. And so civic participation, whether it is amongst different citizens or people within a community or between local constituents and their government, is at low levels. And so that's a problem. And as cities get bigger, it will continue to be a problem. Another big problem is trust. I would assume that if we had 100 people listening, 24 of these people, based on this data, would not trust their public servants. That's actually a very sad state, right? So much money comes in to our governments, and we have such low percent of people who really trust these local governments, these local servants, and people who sort of lead our cities and our communities. And so I'd say that honestly, the even more funny one is only 10% of people trust politicians generally. So these numbers are very difficult, and when you think about it, as cities become bigger, as there are more centralized powers, this probably will not lead to a great outcome. The last problems that we see with growing pains in cities is transparency. It kind of relates to trust, but with transparency is you see cities and states or countries have very large budgets that are used for many different things. Could be for local economic development, could be for recycling, for sustainability, for helping serving underserved communities, and obviously many more. Often though, we don't know necessarily what happens to our budgets. We don't know what happens to these taxpayer dollars that we pay, and where do they go, and what are the outcomes. And there typically, not always, but very typically, is no accountability, right? So money will be spent on different things, on housing, on sustainability, like I was saying, and so forth, but we don't know what happens. And again, this is something that as cities grow, as power is more centralized, will be a big problem. And so what are we doing, and why is Web3 important here? So with technology that is, again, technology to solve a problem, with technology, we can use local coins as a means to incentivize different behaviors within local governments, which I'll explain a little bit more about, and take budgets that these communities have. And a community, by the way, could be a city, could be a neighborhood, it could be a few just people who live in the same block, right? Think about different types of communities that have different budgets. Think about in houses, right? Big apartment buildings have their own homeowners association, right? So you can think about different communities that handle budgets. So with Web3, you can ultimately use these budgets and incentivize people for taking actions that are commensurate with the goals of the budget. For example, recycling, right? Maybe if people recycle a certain amount of times per week, which is what the goals are to get people to recycle, they'll earn a certain amount of local coins. And if you think about it, instead of those dollars just being thrown towards some initiative that people don't end up knowing what happens, here the money goes directly to people for taking action. And I'll explain a little bit more about how it works and how we're doing it in communities. One other thing is the transparency. And so being able to ultimately dictate exactly how these local coins are being used and where are they going and what impact are they making is, in my mind, something that is so necessary.